Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from Comcast, the Spencer family, Chevron, Community Health System, Harris Ranch Resort, Producers Dairy, Caleb and Desiree House, Valley Children's Health Care, and The Wonderful Company. Additional support provided by from the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's public universities. This is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zanti.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. We're discussing Governor Gavin Newsom's 2026 and 2027 budget proposal in this coming legislative cycle. And here with us to break this down are two guests, Gabe Petek from the California Legislative Analyst's Office and Chris Hoene, Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center. Gabe and Chris, thank you so much for joining the Maddy Report today. Really appreciate you being on the program.
Good to be with you.
Well, absolutely. Let's dive right in. I know we have a lot of ground to cover. Obviously, California has a massive budget, but we're going to keep it fairly high level so that folks can glean the highlights from this governor's budget proposal. But first, before we get into that, let's talk about the process of how California's budget is really formed. Maybe if we can start with you, Chris, on this. Can you just talk, maybe focus on the executive branch's role in formulating California's budget? And then Gabe, I'd like to go to you to talk about the legislature's role in passing the budget as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a good split. Gabe and his team are integral to how that legislative part of the process works, of course. So happy to talk a little bit about how the process works for the executive. Key thing for people to understand is that the governor and his budget office, the Department of Finance, get 3 bites at the apple in the state budget process. They get to start off the process by making a proposed spending plan that it constitutionally has to be advanced to the legislature on or before January 10th of each year. So that's why we have a budget proposal in place right now. After the legislature works through their process, which Gabe will describe, I'm sure, shortly, the governor gets a second bite of the apple and gets a second proposal called the May revision, which is required by state law to be released by May 14th. And then after the legislature is done with their process thereafter, the governor has the veto power, which means that they get to line item veto, which means they can reduce any amount of spending, or they can eliminate a program altogether. They can't increase funding or add a new program, but they can do all of that before a budget is signed and put into law on July 1 when the new fiscal year starts.
And Gabe, that's a good transition. We just heard Chris talk about the governor and Department of Finance's role, but the legislature obviously has a major role in forming and shaping California's budget. It doesn't just sail through. There are a number of committees and stakeholders that need to be engaged in the process. Can you share a little bit about what does the legislature's role look like, maybe describing within the same parameters of that timeline that Chris just described?
Yeah, I mean, Chris's description was, very good. After the governor's budget proposal comes out in early January, the legislature begins considering the proposal. And of course, under the California Constitution, the legislature holds the power of appropriation. So in the months after that proposal is released, the legislature reviews, revises, and ultimately decides how state funds are allocated. The legislature is required to pass a balanced budget by June 15th of each year. And so, this deliberative process goes on throughout the spring months and then intensifies after the May revision that Chris described. And so throughout that process, our office, the Legislative Analyst's Office, is busy assisting the legislature in the committee hearings that you referred to, where the members are unpacking in detail the various proposals in the governor's budget.
Thank you. And let's talk real briefly, we'll get into this in the next segment, but some of the high-level priorities that we maybe see in this budget compared to prior budgets that Governor Newsom has proposed, or even other governors. What are just some key high-level takeaways that each of you notice? And Chris, why don't we go to you on this one first?
Well, I think Gabe probably can say more about the detail here, but I think both the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst Office are forecasting that while their revenues seem to be right now coming in at pretty decent levels, they're outpacing projections when we enacted a budget for this year last June. There are some out-year deficit problems that the state needs to resolve, and so I think a lot of what the governor's proposal this year looks like is a proposal that's gearing up for needing to resolve some budget problems in the out years. And so it's kind of a budget that doesn't have a lot of new proposals in it, tries to maintain a lot of programs and commitments made in prior years, and then is trying to reduce some earlier one-time commitments and some other ongoing obligations that were made when the state budget was a little bit more flush in order to try to deal with the fact that if there isn't some change, then there could be some kind of a deficit. Or if there isn't some move to raise additional revenues, which the governor isn't putting anything on the table, then there would need to be some other changes made. So it's not a budget year that's full of grand new programs and ideas. It's sort of a budget that's trying to deal with some challenging fiscal realities.
Thank you, Chris. And Gabe, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll go to your answer next, right after this. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. We were just getting a high-level overview of the state's budget process and some of the key priorities and takeaways in this proposed budget. Gabe, we didn't get to your answer, but what are some of the main priorities or key takeaways from the Legislative Analyst's Office perspective in this proposed budget?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way Chris described it was pretty similar to how we see it. It'd almost say the governor's proposal was a placeholder budget proposal in the sense that there are not a lot of new significant proposals or significant augmentations to existing programs. The current year, the budget, for the proposal for the current year and the upcoming budget year showed a modest deficit. And the governor's proposal included some actions that would eliminate that. He gave some indication that the Department of Finance recognizes that there's some risk to the revenues. Our office feels quite concerned that there's some significant downside risk to the revenue forecast. But where we really are seeing the world similarly is when we look to those out years where both our office and the Department of Finance do forecast that there would be quite significant structural budget deficits in those years.
Thank you, Gabe. And Chris, I want to transition to the topic of education in California and in this budget. The prior Budget Act provided $137 billion in total for TK through 12 education funding. If I'm not mistaken, this is the highest per pupil spending that California has seen per student. How does this compare to previous funding in other budgets, and what measurable impact should we be looking out for as a result of this continued investment going forward?
Well, I think the key thing to understand there is we have a constitutional requirement that voters put in place back in 1988 that creates a minimum funding level for what we now call TK through 14, so transitional kindergarten through community colleges. So there's basically a set of formulas in any given year that determine what funding goes to the to TK, pre-K, K through 12, and community colleges. And so all those formulas are based on how revenues do. So when revenues increase, those systems get more money automatically by formula. If the revenues decrease, then they tend to get less. So in a situation where right now the governor is projecting revenues significantly above where the current year budget had them, that means we're seeing some magnitude of order. The governor's proposal said it was about $20 billion more that's going to go for TK through 14. There have been some updated revenue estimates. Who knows exactly what that looks like, at least as far as what we've seen. I think what that means for all those systems, though, is in a very otherwise lean budget year, It means that like the governor's proposal can continue to fund the full rollout of transitional kindergarten. And it means that a few of the only places where you see some additional funding or some new funding in this budget are for some grant programs in the K through 12 system and in community colleges that I think are made possible by the fact that there's some additional funding inside that system.
Thank you, Chris. And Gabe, we've seen this budget proposal also have expanded support for community colleges in the state of California. What specific programs or services will be expected as a result of this increased support? We just heard Chris talk about the pre-K through 14 funding, but maybe with a specific emphasis on community colleges, what should we expect?
Well, I mean, the community colleges should be in a good place to sustain, course offerings and accommodate student enrollment that may come in, especially, in the broader picture, the state economy is not generating a significant number of jobs outside of the healthcare sector. And so when we see that trend, a lot of times over the years, there's been more growth in enrollment in community colleges as people seek to upskill their resumes. And so we could see that, and the colleges should be in a good position for that. I think I'd just say in the overall about Prop 98, it's in a somewhat different place than the non-Proposition 98 side of the budget, where it's getting sort of this constitutionally guaranteed level of funding, even as in the broader picture, we see gradually declining enrollment trends. And so that's going to be a longer term kind of secular trend that we're going to have to watch as the revenues continue to grow, along with personal income in the state, benefiting the Prop 98 side of the budget. But the other thing I would just say about it is so much of this recent growth that we've seen in the state tax revenues has been from a very strong, if not overheated, stock market.
Well, that's certainly a good point and a good note to end on. We're going to take another quick break and we'll be right back after this. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Gabe Petek from the Legislative Analyst's Office and Chris Hoene from the California Budget and Policy Center. Thank you both for joining us today. Really appreciate your expertise and insights. Let's shift gears from education to healthcare. In this governor's 2026-2027 budget continues to focus on potential or ongoing healthcare changes. And the budget reflects investments in spending for Medi-Cal. Talk us through this funding and what is it aiming to do? Any major changes to previous budget cycles that maybe we should be aware of? Why don't we start with you on this one, Gabe, and then we'll go to Chris.
Well, in the Medi-Cal is one of the fastest growing areas of the state budget. It's doubled in the last decade. And so Medi-Cal spending has outpaced the growth in the rest of the in the rest of the state budget. And, in addition to these trends in Medi-Cal, what we've seen is the passage of H.R. 1 in Washington, D.C., the federal bill, which is limiting some of the coverage or some of the federal funds that go into Medi-Cal and shift more of the burden to the state government. And so some of what is happening here is that the governor has proposed some changes that reflect that or mirror that to some extent. And so some of the most notable proposals in my mind were that the governor included in January a proposal to end comprehensive coverage for certain immigrant groups and apply certain community engagement or what they call work requirements to certain populations. And so these will be done to help defray some of the cost burden that is being shifted to the state and help address the state's longer-term fiscal challenges. But of course, the policy trade-offs are going to be very difficult, and the members in the legislature will, be grappling with that in the rest of the budget process, because some of the equity considerations that come up as a result of this, And it's just, change to how comprehensive our safety net in California would be.
Thank you, Gabe. And Chris, going to you, maybe talking a little bit about the federal funding changes that have been experienced or on the horizon. How does California's budget either make up for certain reductions in spending from the federal government or shift to adapt to that changing environment? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the two biggest areas where there are reductions in key services for Californians and cost shifts to the California state budget from HR 1 are in Medi-Cal, which is the biggest chunk of that, but also in food assistance, or what we call CalFresh. And we could see somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million people who lose access to health insurance because of the federal cuts, and somewhere around 2 million folks in the state who could lose access or partial access to food assistance. Some of that will mean less federal money comes into the state, but in that case, it's oftentimes federal money that goes directly into the pockets of the individuals who need it most. It doesn't necessarily pass through the state government or doesn't necessarily land in a state budget fund. There are cost shifts in each case to the state budget as well. So there's in the neighborhood of 2.3 to 5.1 billion, depending on the year, cost shift from the federal government to the state to help cover the food assistance program, something historically the state has never had to take on. So that will contribute to some of the out-year deficit challenges that Gabe was talking about earlier. And the cost of the state, the cost shifting to the state, at least the governor's estimate is that we're, for this next year, that would be about $1 billion, but it likely grows in future years because HR 1's implementation happens over about a 5-year period. So there's some cost shifts there. I think the reality is there's no way that the state can backfill all that the federal government was doing that it's now cut. And it certainly can't cover all of those costs without actually coming up with like a more comprehensive strategy to deal with out-year deficits and the HR 1 cuts. And that means there's going to have to be some conversation on the revenue side of things. You can't solely do this on the spending side without the state doing just what Gabe said, which is starting to make some of their own cuts that look very much like what just got passed at the federal level.
Thank you for that. We're going to take another quick break and we'll be right back after this. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. Gabe and Chris, thank you for joining the program today. I really appreciate your time and for being here to discuss California's proposed 2026-2027 budget. Before you go, just a couple of final questions and issues. We've heard about healthcare and education and how this budget has really been a placeholder budget, possibly some of the effects and ongoing things to look out for future structural budget deficits. But there are other items I think that are important to bring up and address. Housing and homelessness, certainly something that's been a prominent issue here in California. Could you talk a little bit about what are some of the items in this proposed budget that pertain to ongoing funding or support for affordable housing or reduction in homelessness or services for homeless, and what should we expect going forward? Can you talk a little bit about this? Maybe we'll start with you, Gabe, on this one.
Well, this is an example where the budget reflects a fair amount of restraint. There has been an ongoing program since around 2020 where the state has provided homelessness, housing assistance, and prevention program funding, which is one-time grant funding to local governments. They call it HAP. And this HAP program funding has totaled around $5 billion since 2020. And although there was previously planned about $500 million that would go out in the 2026-27 year, and the governor does maintain that commitment in his proposal. He doesn't add another round of funding under his budget proposal, and so many local governments would, of course, welcome additional state resources, but at this time, the state really isn't in a position to provide a lot of additional grant funding to local governments for this program.
Thank you, Gabe. And Chris, shifting to you for the last question of the day, the governor's proposed budget includes little funding to implement Proposition 36, which was passed by voters throughout the state of California. I know that your center is nonpartisan, the LAO is nonpartisan, and so while there might be some politics that could be surrounding this issue, we won't ask you to get into that. But maybe speaking from a broader perspective, when the governor maybe proposes a budget that decides not to fund these types of initiatives, how could this affect the implementation or the effectiveness of a voter-passed measure like this?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Prop 36 was passed with no intention of actually finding a way to pay for the additional costs of incarcerating people if you're arresting them for more minor offenses. The folks who put it forward wanted to allow more discretion for local law enforcement to jail people, to prosecute people for lower level offenses, but didn't put forward a way to pay for that. So you now have more discretion at the local level for this to happen. And now you have local government, law enforcement agencies looking to the state to pick up the tab. The governor has essentially consistently, even in the run up to the election that led to Prop 36 and afterwards, said the state's not on the hook for decisions you're making about how you manage your local law enforcement. That's a decision you need to make, and you need to figure out how to cover the costs on your own. Now, I also think there's a perspective that voters did pass it, and therefore the governor should, follow the will of the voters. But I think those politics that were tricky that you talked about have continued to play out in the budgets that have followed the passage of the measure.
I think that's a really good point, and I just want to conclude on that note. Chris Hoene from the California Budget and Policy Center and Gabe Petek from the California Legislative Analyst Office, both great nonpartisan resources here in the state of California that do incredible work. Thank you for joining the Maddy Report today. I really appreciate your insights and expertise.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Blake.
And thank you for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit themaddyinstitute.org. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.